on average, how many decisions do you believe the average person makes each day? Throw some numbers out there, friends. 1 million? 200? Okay, we're pretty, once, okay. You're sitting pretty close to be that far apart, but that's good. Any other guesses? And if you're watching online, throw some guesses in there. 1,000. A lot. I love that answer. All right, would you believe if I told you that the average human makes 35,000 decisions a day? So, I began to think about that. And I looked at multiple sites that said the same answer. And then I looked at another site where this man was saying there's no way you can make this many decisions. But then I began to think about, okay, let me think about this deeper. A lot of decisions we make in life, we don't even realize we're making. So I started to think about that. And it was the moment I scratched my chin that I realized I just made a decision and I didn't even realize it. And so the other day, I went to go get on my computer, so I had to go get my laptop. I got my laptop. Now I have multiple ways I can get to my dining room in my house, and so I chose one direction to get there. I sat down. I put my computer on the table. I pushed my chair. I decided to slide my chair, and again, you're doing these things without even realize you're doing them, but you're doing them. And then I realized the chair went in too far, so I slid it back a little bit. And then I opened up my laptop and realized I needed to get a little closer to me. And then the itch on my chin came. And so I decided to itch that. Again, it snapped judgments. And then I got a notification on my phone. I looked at it and I made the decision to swipe it. I get on my computer, decided to go on Chrome, Google Chrome. I opened up a web browser. I had to type in every single poke of a letter is a decision that I had to make. Now you might be thinking, man, you're really overthinking this. But it really are. We make a lot of decisions in life without even realizing we're making a lot of decisions in life. And then my leg itched, and I itched that. Then I got another notification on my phone, and I actually opened that up, and then I began to type each number on my phone. And then I got to the emails I needed to get to, and I began to type on my emails. And that all happened in a matter of 2 minutes or less. And so a lot of times we might make decisions of, little things in life, and we're doing them so quickly that we're not even realizing that we're doing them, however we are. Life is ultimately made up of the decisions we make. Many probably are minuscule like this. Maybe they have no really meaning or value. They just are things that you do. But I guarantee you, if you begin to think about life in those little ways, you're going to see how many little things you're going to do without even realizing you're doing them, but they're ultimately a decision, a choice that you're making to do. That your brain's telling it to do something, or you're saying, should I do this or should I do that? And they're snapped. They're so quick that are taking place. Some decisions in life are a lot more difficult than itching a chin or pulling this chair out and having to readjust my chair. And oftentimes, that's why we don't think about the minuscule ones, because there are really big decisions we have to make in life. Maybe life is looked more at by the big decisions than the minuscule ones that we make on a daily basis of making 35,000. Today we're going to look at the story of a man named Abraham. And we're going to look at a big decision he had to make. And that big decision that Abraham had to make is going to challenge our loyalty in terms of our relationship with God. And so if you have a Bible, you can turn me to Genesis chapter 22. I just made a decision to scratch above my eyebrow right now. Starts off like this. Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. Abraham, God called. Yes, he replied, here I am. Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you. The next morning, Abraham got up early, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his servants with him, along with his son Isaac. Then he chopped wood for a fire, for a burnt offering, and set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day of their journey, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Is that a difficult decision to make? I don't know if I've ever been faced with a decision like that. God tells something to Abraham. Get up, take your son, Isaac, whom you love so much. Again, the writer there is getting us to see the picture of this relationship Abraham has with his son, Isaac. Take your son, whom you love so much, get up and go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering. I don't know about you, but I'd be like, are you crazy, God? Are you crazy? Well, it says the next morning they got up early and left. We get to the place now where he sees the place in the distance. In verse 5, he says this, "Stay here with the donkey," Abraham told the servants. "The boy and I will travel a little further. We will worship there, and then we will come right back." We will worship there, and then we will come right back. Now, again, as I look at this story, to me, I try to read the Bible with like this like wonder, but also skepticism and all these different pieces. And I'm like, why would you ever say there, Abraham, we will worship there, and then we'll come right back? Like, you're about to go offer your son as a burnt offering to God, and you're saying we're going to go worship. We will worship. This idea of a burnt offering is this. When something was offered, it was entirely consumed by the fire, and it went up to God, expressing the ascent of the soul in worship. That was a picture of the soul, of an act of worship. And so placing a burnt offering was an act of worship. And so Abraham already had this idea in mind of what God was after. And he says, we will worship. We will worship. And this is where we see that loyalty is on trial. That who or what do you ultimately worship, Abraham? Abraham's been waiting a long time for this son. Abraham's 100 years old. If you don't know the story of Abraham, Abraham is called out by God that Abraham would be a person that through Abraham, all the nations of the world, you even sitting in here today, would be blessed. And to do that, he needed a child for his name to go on. And he finally has his son that God called him to have. And now God is saying, give that child back to me as an offering. Loyalty here is on trial. Who or what do you worship? Who or what do you worship? Let's lighten the mood a little bit. Can I lighten the mood real quick? Got serious pretty quick. Henry Ward Beecher was a pastor that people loved to come and hear. And so people would travel from all over to come in and listen to his sermons because he was well known and people just liked to hear him. And so one day he had a substitute preacher come in, and no one knew about it until that moment where the preacher stood up, which happened to be Beecher's brother, and began to preach, and people began to stand up and exit the building. When that man, who had the strength, said this, all who have come here to worship Henry Beecher, you may leave. But anybody who's come to worship God, you may stay. You know, that's really a picture of life. What do we honestly worship? Deep down in the layers of our soul, what do we worship? Here's the thing. The decisions we make in life prove ultimately what we worship. The decisions we make in life prove ultimately what we worship. And this is where the minuscule comes in. Because, yeah, it might not be itching my chin, but it might be how you spend your time. and you don't think anything of it. Or how you spend this, and you don't think anything of it. Oh, it's minuscule. It's minuscule. But really, it's proving what you worship, that the decisions you make build upon each other, and they prove what you worship in life. They prove what you worship in life. You know, oftentimes we think of worship as what we just did up here. Some people singing, some people out there singing. But worship is our whole life. We were created to be people of worship, that it's our lives that are worship, that everything we do is worship. Romans says to offer our bodies as living sacrifices, as people who would give our lives over to a life of worship, whether that be through work or whether that be through how we spend our finances or how we spend our time in our neighborhoods or what we watch on TV. Everything we have is a life of worship. That's what the Christian life is all about. And the decisions we make in life prove ultimately what we worship in life. Because we cannot see ourselves sometimes clearly. John Soper, who used to be one of the leaders in the Christian Missionary Alliance, a couple times I've been in some more intimate settings with him, and his phrase that he says continually is, we have an infinite capacity. Fill in the rest. For self-deception. We have an infinite capacity for self-deception. That we might think, oh yeah, I worship God because I do 1, 2, and 3. I worship God because I do this, this, and this. And he says, no, every decision you make is ultimately showing what we worship in life. And it's not about filling in the blanks or checking off the boxes of worship. But it's about our hearts. And who do we long for? And so we're going to go back through this story again. And we're going to go a little bit further into the story. Because maybe someone here is just hoping to find out what happens. But we're going to look at different keys of worship from this story that will help us discover the decisions we're making and ultimately what we worship. Let's go back here. Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. Abraham, God called. Yes, he replied, here I am. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love so much. Again, he's saying you love this kid. And go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you. Here we begin right here. To worship God, we must confront what we love in life. To worship God, we must ultimately confront what we love in life. In this case for Abraham, this is what I believe God is saying. Do you worship your child or do you worship me? God. You've been waiting your whole life for this child I've said you were going to have, and you love him so much. Do you worship him or do you worship me? We can have a whole sermon series just on that. Do we love God or do we love our children more? Do we worship our children more than we worship God? I just want to let you in real quick. We're just going to take a sidestep real here because I think this is a big aspect of this text that God was doing in Abraham's life. But, excuse me. But we're just going to look at it real quick. So I threw this out to a couple of friends at Rome Alliance Church this week. Here's some of the dialogue we had. One person chimed in and said, you know, we live in a land where it really is at extremes. We have, in one hand, children are forgotten about. We live in a land where children really are an inconvenience in many ways because people worship something else, themselves or whatever it be. On the other hand, you have people who say, I don't care about myself. I just want my kids to be happy. I'm willing to do anything for my kids to be comfortable. I'll take a back seat for my kids. Then you have other people who they use their children to have their own sense of fulfillment in life. Through their sports and through their grades and through their other things. If they do well, I do well in life. I'm fulfilled. We have also things like fear-based worship. If my child doesn't do this, they might not have a good reputation. If my child doesn't do this, then this. That's just some of it. And Abraham is looking at this, and God's like, Abraham, do you love your child? Or ultimately, do you love me? Is it me you worship, or is it your child in this life that I've given you? If we were to look at this morning, and this wasn't our question, maybe this is your question, and I encourage you to maybe even look in into that one deeper if you feel like that's something that God wants you to look at. But if that wasn't it, what is the earthly thing that you'd say, yeah, I love this, that God would challenge in your life? Do you love this or do you love me? Do you love this or do you love me? What is that thing that you'd put up there? That God would say, go and sacrifice that. Give that to me. Because I want all of you. And so to worship God fully, we must confront what we love. And that's a decision we have to make in life. Do we go after the things we love because we love them? Or do we go after God? Now, sometimes those things go together, that when we worship God, yes, He gives us the desires of our heart. But we're painting a picture here that ultimately we love this. It's called idolatry. We love this more than we love God. You'll have no other gods before me. That we've placed something else in the place of God in our life. What would that be for you? The other thing we see here is we're going to go on in this story. Thank you. Is this. To worship God, it requires obedience. To worship God, it requires obedience. This idea of worshiping involved bowing down before God, or a God in general. But that true worship involved bowing down in obedience. That's what they would have an understanding of in this culture. And that when God gives us a command, our obedience demonstrates that command, and that is an act of worship. John 14:15, Jesus says, if you love me, obey my commandments. If you love me. And so as we look at this idea of what we love, compare that now to what the Word of God says. And are we obedient to that? Our obedience demonstrates our worship. And here it says, the next morning Abraham got up early. I don't know about you, but I'd probably hit the snooze button like 8 times. This is what God wanted me to do. I'd hit the snooze button like 8 times. He saddled up his donkey and took 2 of his servants with him, along with his son Isaac. Then he chopped wood for a fire for a burnt offering and set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day of their journey, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He looks at the servants and he says, stay here. The boy and I will travel a little further and we will worship there. And then we will come right back. I think at this point, though, there's something deep inside of Abraham that trusts God for something. I don't know, because he says, we will come right back. You're going to do this. Verse 6 says, so Abraham placed the wood for the burnt offering on Isaac's shoulders. Are you serious, Dad? Not only are you going to do this, but you're making him carry the wood there himself? While he carried the fire, he carried the fire and the knife. And the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac turned to Abraham and said, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. We have the fire and the wood, the boy said, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering? I'm not sure that's a conversation I want to have. I might try to avoid that one, in honesty. Abraham says, God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son. Abraham answered, and they both walked on together. When we worship God in our lives, when loyalty is on trial, worship requires us, the worship of God requires us to make difficult decisions in life. And this is where ultimately it can confront our lives in a real way. Because we've grown up with this idea of the least path of resistance. Run from things that are difficult. And again, this is so ingrained. We talk about minuscule decisions. If I said you were if you were going to have a headache later this afternoon, what would you have ready to go with it? Right. We don't want pain. So we already know where we're going to when I say you have a headache, because we want to avoid pain. We want to avoid difficult things in life. But the worship of God is going to require that we make difficult decisions. You're going to face, at some point in life, a decision. Am I going to go do this, or am I going to do this? Am I going to do this, or am I going to do that? Life is made up of decisions, and ultimately they prove what we worship. They prove what we worship. Now let's think about that again when it comes to our children. We don't want anything hard for them. We want to keep things easy for them. We want to keep things comfortable for them. Worship requires us. The worship of God requires us to make difficult decisions. It's not an easy thing. Let me tell you, there's a lot of choices in life to make. There's a lot of choices to make on Sunday mornings in life. We talk about here being a church that joins on Sunday. That's our glorified God. There's a lot of decisions that are going to come up to say, don't go and worship with the body of Christ today. Go do this instead. Again, worship isn't just what happens in here, but yes, it ultimately is a big part of it. And so let's go on in this story while Abraham has made the difficult decision. It says, when they arrived at the place where God had told him to go, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. Then he tied his son Isaac and laid him on the altar in the top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. Difficult decision. I thought there was a sheep, Dad, and here you are with a knife. At that moment, an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Yes, Abraham replied, here I am again. Don't lay a hand on the boy, the angel said. Do not hurt him in any way, and from now on I know that you will truly fear God. You have not withheld from me even your son, your only son. You've not done that. And so not only did Abraham make the difficult decision, but with difficult decisions, it requires action. And when we worship God, there's an action component to it. That oftentimes in the Christian life, I believe we base ourselves off our intentions. Abraham is going to be like, yeah, I'll get to it next week. I'll get to it next week. Or I'll do it later. I'll do it later. Right? We do that often with things. Like maybe God puts something on your heart and you're like, oh, I'll do it some other time. I'll push that off a little bit. But the worship of God ultimately requires action. It's not just something we sit and do. It's something we are moving and we're part of everyday life that requires action. Can you imagine that action right there? Now you can hear the horror music, whatever your favorite horror movie is. And he has a knife over his son's body. That's insanity, right? But God was painting a picture for him of what it looked like to worship him and to give up his only son for him. Life. It says here, then Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in its thorns in the thicket. So he took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham named the place Yahweh Yireh, which I can't read, that's what it means. The Lord will provide. To this day, people still use that name as a proverb. On the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. You know, the interesting thing about this passage is in 14 verses, the word burnt offering is used 5 times. And at the end of the day, the most ultimate thing about our worship is that worship is an offering. That's what it is. Worship is an offering. It's something that we give to God. It's expressing the assent of the soul of, here I am, God, I am yours. Here I am, God. Everything I have, including my child, is yours. It's yours to do with. Not what I want to do with it, not what I have, and the decisions we make prove, ultimately, what we worship. Everyday decisions, our loyalty is on trial. Do we worship God or do we worship something else? And so as we look at this story, what do you need to offer up? If this is you placed in this story, it might not be a child. What would be placed in your story that God would say, give this to me? And your loyalty is on trial. Are you going to give that over to God, or are you going to keep that for yourself and do what you will with it? Because worship ultimately is an offering. You have a decision to make. It's going to outweigh the other 34,999 decisions you're going to make this week. It's a big one. And God is speaking something into our lives that He wants us to offer up to Him. He wants us to offer up to Him. But here's the piece of it all. God is not asking you to do something that He hasn't done Himself. Maybe if you know this story, maybe you've seen this story, ultimately we can see this as a foreshadowing of what God has done for us. Isaac carried the wood up on his back, just like Jesus carried his own wood to the cross. He carried the cross on his back. Jesus was that offering for us. That God gave up his only son for us. And in return, he's asking us to offer up our very best back to him. That's the heart of the gospel, that God gave his very best in Jesus. He offered up his best for us, that we may have life, and life to the full. We may have eternal life. And this picture is that God will provide. God has provided for us in the most sufficient way through his Son, Jesus Christ, that he'd be willing to offer up his only Son. You know, one of the things that maybe is in here is the hard piece we haven't talked about, but most of us we couldn't even imagine if one of our children had passed away, let alone God saying, give him back to me. But again, God isn't asking something of us that he hasn't done himself. Even God has lost a child. His child was the first fruits from the dead, though, the one we look to. And do we believe that enough about the gospel that when we look at our everyday decisions, that we say, okay, God, here's an opportunity to give this back to you. And the decisions we make ultimately are a way to prove who and what we worship. And every day, our loyalty is on trial to say, is it me? God's saying that. Or is it something else? If you have one, write it down. Or think about it. Pray about it this week. God, is there one thing that you want me to give back to you that's all yours? Maybe that means meeting with someone to flesh it out a little bit, or talking with someone to say, what does this actually look like to put this more into action? It might be a difficult decision. It might require action. It might make you confront what you love. But God is saying, I want that. I want your heart. And ultimately what we're doing is giving back something God has already done for us by sending his Son Jesus to die for us. As we think and meditate on that one thing, worship team's going to come back up. We're going to play a final song this morning just to continue to meditate our hearts on what it is that God would ask of us to be willing to give back to him as an act of worship, as an offering to him.